I recently received a welcome gift from Michael Ginsberg at Legion Paper, which was a huge assortment of sample stocks. So I'm testing today Lanaquarelle 300 pound rough. It's a satiny, random textured paper with apparently good lifting qualities. The sketch study I'll be doing for the next series of 8 or 9 swatches will be a New Zealand silver eye. I'm just going to quickly draw one sketch which I can then slip behind each of the swatch samples and trace through on a light box. Saves me resketching a bird 9 times. So I'm using a homemade 3 foot by 2 foot light box. Here it is traced. Camera's slightly poorly framed. Now I'm using Winsor & Newton liquid frisket masking fluid. I coat the point brush with soap first so that the fluid doesn't bond. I'm using phthalo green, sap green, Prussian blue and Payne's grey to make a background wash. With the power of hindsight, I can tell you that I put this first layer of background wash on way too densely. If you're going to be glazing, it's important to let your paint stain the paper without leaving a layer of paint-like paste on the surface of the paper. We'll see this mistake come back to bite me. But I can tell you that paint goes onto this paper with a satiny, sumptuous feel. It also stays moist longer than any stock I've worked with before, which is consistent with the fact that I've heard this paper has got a lot of surface sizing. It should make it good for lifting. We'll see if it affects glazing. Of course, no matter how well surface sized a paper is, you want the paint to eventually soak into the paper. So the first blooms I'm trying, which is by dropping a clear droplet of water over satin dry paint, seem to be lifting even phthalo green, which is a typically staining type of pigment, almost completely back to the clear white of the paper. So could even be excessively prone to lifting. For people that want to use a lot of deliberate lifting techniques, and I'm starting to, can be exciting. For people that want to focus on glazing translucent layers without lifting the paint underneath, it could be problematic. I was able to pull out and reactivate leaves from the square panelled background and pretty seamlessly drag them off the edge of the paper, which again on almost any other stock would have left a faint dark line. Now that it's dry, I'm just going to lay in a river rock. Apologies to any ornithologists out there. I'm well aware that silver eye is a perching bird and you'll never see one on a river rock. I just wanted to test painting both a bird and some speckled bloomed rocks. So I'm taking a little bit of artistic license. Again, paint is very easy to lay in wet on wet. It feathers pretty easily, pretty softly, and again the paint stays active for a sumptuous amount of time. Just dropping in some yellow ochre to add a bit of richness. And the first blooms, again lifting very, very brightly and keeping quite a bit of that cauliflower definition that I like. I do want to get more subtle secondary blooms revealing a glazed underlayer of paint rather than just the white paper in some cases, but I'll test that later on. For now, the lifting properties are, as I have been led to believe, exquisite in this paper. I'm able to feather off into nothing with clear water after laying down a swash of wet on dry paint. So it's proving relatively easy to work with. Now this is dried, and you can see the blooms have left a very clear cauliflower random abstract texture. I'm just going to waste a little bit of time painting some ripples and reflections. Doubly wasted because it's also off camera. We'll see them a bit later when we zoom out. Just touching up these rocks a little bit. Now I'm going to compound the cardinal error I made by laying on an almost paste-like thickness of paint in the first place by trying to glaze over it. It doesn't matter what paper you're using, this will almost never work. I'm a glutton for punishment. In the lighter areas it glazes okay, doesn't seem to completely obliterate the paint underneath. You can see the bloom is still showing through even over glazing, but in the areas where the paint is very dense and sitting on the surface almost like a paste, even though it's dry, it just won't glaze at all. Some papers are more forgiving. Saunders Waterford allows glazing over quite dense coats, but it's a slower to paint on more absorptive stock, and it doesn't lift. So I'm just putting in some glazed shadows on the rocks. I'm able to feather that off with water, and again it's treating the paint underneath with a little bit of dignity. It's not muddying it up, so I'm becoming a little bit more happy with this paper for glazing, and I'm certainly impressed by how it lifts. I've just mixed some sap green and Hunter yellow, a little bit of lemon yellow. Lemon yellow by Schmenke is a greenish hued yellow. It's pretty hard to get a simple chromium bright yellow without any greenish hues, so I always add in a bit of Hunter yellow to warm it up, dropping in some yellow ochre and burnt umber to make the wing coverlets a little bit more olive than lime. And again I'm able to re-feather in areas that have already had paint down to re-blend them. In this regard it's easier to work with even than Arche, which will always leave the stained outline of the brushstroke you lay down first. But again it's consistent with the fact that this paper lifts very easily. I think it's going to be the only paper in the world with more surface sizing than Arche. Again, reblending is going okay. I'm not working at it too much, just dropping in some Payne's grey to darken that grey area, dropping in some more burnt sienna light, and I'm able to lift that to indicate a little bit of soft downy feather overlapping the wing coverlets. Bleeding back a shadow under the wing goes quite smoothly, and I'm able to fine line in some primary and secondary feather definitions and wash those back a little bit. I normally would pay a lot more time and attention to feet if I were doing a real bird study, but this is just a paper swatch, so I'm just going to loosely indicate these. The surprising thing about wax eyes for such a small, delicate songbird is they've really got quite large feet. They have a little black mascara-like mask lining around that outer white eye ring. Really helps make the eye ring pop. Their beaks fade from a pale dove grey to an almost creamy beige near the tip. I'm laying in an underlayer of sienna and ochre to add a little bit of richness and translucence when I paint the sepia eye later. Just fussing around with this beak a little bit too much. eye detailing. The frisket is still on, so I'm only painting up to the masked in areas, which includes the highlight in the center. So I've taken the frisket off now. I didn't film that process, so I can complete the eye detail. I want to very loosely shade the top of the high lit area, so it's not white, it's just a subtle lightening, and leave one white highlight spot for a sunspot. We're almost complete, and there's our finished silver eye. The paper was exceptional in terms of blooming and lifting. A little bit too lifty to make glazing completely seamless. Once this paper had dried, I began to suspect I might have given it a little bit of a rough run. I suspect my glazing issues were more pilot error than paper constraints. So I did some broad sweeping washes, glazed over the back of the tail, then when the wash was dried, did a simple leaf silhouette glaze, and the glaze held up fine. I also did a broad blended wash on the other side, and checked out the blooms in a broad wash. All in all, I think this paper is exquisite. I decided to further test the glazing, see the breaking point of the paper, and after heavier, 3 or 4 layers of glazing, the paper did begin to pill a little bit, which can be a concern in my large format wildlife art. Simple, lighter glazes were still quite exquisite. I was able to feather the paint out without it muddying, but that pilling on the dense layers was a bit intriguing, disturbing. There was also some nice abstract effects from blending with blooming. So all in all, I think this paper is probably dropping to number 2 on my stock list after Saunders Waterford, but it's a very narrow margin.